There was a time when the word rich did not exist. Not because people were too primitive to understand the concept, but because the concept itself had no meaning yet. You cannot be rich in a world where nobody owns anything. You cannot be poor in a world where everything belongs to everyone. And for the first 290,000 years of human existence, that is almost exactly the world humans lived in. No money. No property. No banks. No inheritance. No poverty. No wealth. Just people, moving across a landscape, taking what they needed, leaving what they did not, and waking up the next morning to do it again. So how did that change? How did a species that spent the vast majority of its existence in radical equality end up building pyramids with slave labor, constructing palaces that took generations to complete, and creating a world where some people had everything and most people had almost nothing? That story did not begin with greed. It did not begin with ambition. It began with something far more ordinary. It began with a good day hunting. Picture a band of early humans moving across the African savanna roughly 100,000 years ago. There are maybe 25 to 30 people in the group. They are related to each other, most of them. They have been moving together for years. They share food automatically. When someone makes a kill, everyone eats. When someone finds a berry bush heavy with fruit, they call the others over. Not because they are morally superior to modern humans. Not because they have been taught to share. But because sharing is the only strategy that works when any individual can have a catastrophically bad day at any moment. Today you bring meat to camp. Tomorrow you might come back empty-handed. The only insurance policy that exists is the goodwill of the people around you. Anthropologists call this system demand sharing. And it is brutally egalitarian. If you have something and someone asks for it, you give it. Refusing to share is one of the most serious social violations possible in hunter-gatherer societies. It marks you as selfish, dangerous, and untrustworthy. People who refuse to share get excluded. And in a world without hospitals or grocery stores, exclusion from the group is a death sentence. This system worked extraordinarily well for an extraordinarily long time. But it had one consequence that set the stage for everything that came after. It made accumulation almost impossible. What was the point of killing more animals than your band could eat? The meat would rot. What was the point of collecting more nuts than you could carry? You were going to move camp in 3 days anyway. In a world of mobility and mandatory sharing, having more than you needed was not an advantage. It was a burden. But not everything could be shared equally. And this is where the first seeds of something like status began to grow. You could not share skill. You could not demand that someone hand over their ability to make a better spear, track an animal through difficult terrain, or know which plants were safe to eat and which would kill you. Knowledge and ability were the first forms of wealth that could not be redistributed by social pressure. And the people who possessed them occupied a different position in the group than those who did not. The best hunter in a band of 30 people was not rich in any material sense. He owned nothing more than anyone else. But he ate better consistently, because he was more likely to be included in any hunting party. He had more influence over group decisions because people trusted his judgment. He was more likely to have his pick of mates because his skills signaled genetic quality and survival competence. He was the person others came to when they needed advice, when they needed someone to lead a dangerous expedition, when they needed to resolve a dispute. This is the first form of wealth in human history. Not possessions. Not money. Not land. Reputation. The accumulated social credit that came from being genuinely useful to the people around you. And the fascinating thing about this form of wealth is that it was both real and fragile. A great hunter who had a run of bad luck and came home empty-handed repeatedly would find his status eroding. A healer whose remedies stopped working would lose influence. A leader who made a catastrophic decision that got people killed would find that people stopped listening. Ancient status had to be continuously earned and continuously maintained. There was no way to inherit it, no way to store it up against future failures, and no way to protect it if your actual competence declined. So where did the first real inequality come from? The answer is one of the most consequential accidents in human history. Around 15,000 years ago, in the period archaeologists call the Late Upper Paleolithic, some human groups began doing something their ancestors had almost never done. They started staying in one place. Not forever. Not immediately with full permanence. But in certain especially resource-rich locations, particularly along coastlines teeming with shellfish, near rivers thick with salmon during spawning season, or in valleys where large herds of animals returned predictably year after year, some groups discovered that moving was no longer necessary. The food came to them. Or it was so abundant in one location that they could eat for months without needing to travel. And when you stop moving, something fundamental changes. Suddenly it makes sense to build a more permanent structure. Suddenly it makes sense to store food rather than consume it immediately, because you are going to be here next month, and having reserves means security. And suddenly, for the first time in human existence, you can accumulate things. Physical objects. Stored food. Materials. Tools. The people who controlled the best locations, who had built the most effective storage systems, who had accumulated the largest reserves, began to have something genuinely new in human experience. A material advantage that persisted through time and did not depend entirely on their personal skill or daily performance. They were, in a meaningful sense, the first wealthy people on Earth. But here is where it gets interesting. Because the first wealthy people did not look anything like the rich people who came after them. Archaeological evidence from the late Paleolithic and early Mesolithic periods, roughly 15,000 to 8,000 years ago, shows something surprising about the sites where humans were beginning to settle more permanently. The material inequality between individuals was relatively modest. Some people had more elaborate tools or more decorative objects. Some burials contained more grave goods than others, suggesting higher status. But the differences were not dramatic. The gap between the best-off and worst-off members of a community was nothing like what came later. The reason is that the old social rules did not disappear overnight. The pressure to share, the stigma against accumulation, the cultural expectation that those with more would give to those with less, these were still deeply embedded in human social behavior. They had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. They did not vanish simply because the economic conditions had changed. What changed them was something more gradual. And it started with a question that had never been asked before in human history. Can I pass this on to my children? In a mobile hunter-gatherer group, inheritance barely existed as a concept. A great hunter died and his skills died with him. His knowledge might be passed on through teaching, but his possessions, minimal as they were, would be distributed among the group. There was no real mechanism for intergenerational transfer of advantage. Every generation essentially started over. But once you had a permanent settlement with stored food, built structures, and a location with reliable resources, you had something transferable. A father could leave his children in a house he had built, with food stores he had accumulated, in a location he had selected for its quality. For the first time in human history, the accident of your birth began to matter in a material sense. Not just in terms of who taught you skills, but in terms of what physical resources you started life with. This is the moment the concept of wealth in anything like the modern sense first became possible. Not when someone first had more than others, but when someone could ensure that their children would start life with more than other people's children. When advantage became heritable. When the accident of birth began to determine the trajectory of a life. The clearest archaeological evidence of this transformation comes from the Natufian culture in the Levant, the region that is today Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon, between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. The Natufians were among the first humans to build permanent villages. They hunted and gathered but from fixed bases rather than moving camps. And their burial sites tell a remarkable story. Early Natufian burials show relatively little differentiation. Some people were buried with more objects than others, but not dramatically so. But as time passed and Natufian settlements became more established and more permanent, the burials change. Some individuals begin to appear with extraordinary quantities of grave goods. Elaborate headdresses made from hundreds of carefully drilled shell beads. Necklaces of animal teeth. Decorated tools. Objects that clearly required enormous amounts of time and skill to produce. One burial discovered at a site called Mallaha contained the skeleton of an elderly woman buried with a puppy, a collection of shells from distant coastlines, and a positioning of the body that suggested great care and ceremony. Whoever this woman was, she mattered enormously to the people who buried her. She was not a chieftain in any formal sense. There was no political structure to hold that title. But she was something. A healer perhaps, a keeper of knowledge, a spiritual authority. Someone whose death the community marked with extraordinary attention. This is the earliest wealthy person whose story we can partially read. Not wealthy in gold. Not wealthy in land. But wealthy in the thing that ancient wealth was always ultimately about. Other people's recognition of your importance. Then about 10,000 years ago, agriculture arrived, and everything accelerated. Farming created surpluses on a scale that mobile hunter-gatherer life never could. A successful farming community could produce far more food than it needed to survive, and that surplus could be stored, taxed, traded, and controlled. And control of the surplus became the new definition of wealth. Whoever controlled the grain controlled the people who needed the grain to eat. The first recognizable wealthy class in human history was probably not a warrior or a king. It was a storage manager. The person who kept the records of how much grain was in the communal store, who had contributed what, and who was owed what in return. We know this because the earliest writing ever discovered, clay tablets from Sumer in modern Iraq dating to around 3400 BC, is not poetry or philosophy or religious text. It is accounting. Lists of grain quantities. Records of who owned which animals. Tallies of labor performed and owed. The bureaucrat came before the king. The accountant came before the army. Wealth, in its first organized form, was a record-keeping system. And the people who controlled the records controlled everything that followed. From there the story moves fast. Storage managers became administrators. Administrators gained political power. Political power attracted military protection. Military protection enabled taxation. Taxation funded armies. Armies conquered neighbors. Conquered neighbors became laborers. Laborers built monuments. Monuments announced power. And power attracted more power until you had pharaohs, emperors, and dynasties stretching across centuries. But it all began with something almost embarrassingly small. A good hunting season. A location near a river. A decision to stay rather than move. A clay tablet with grain counts scratched into it by someone who probably did not realize they were inventing civilization. The first rich person in human history did not know they were rich. They had no word for it. They had no concept to frame it. They simply had slightly more than the person next to them, and slightly more influence over what happened next, and slightly more ability to ensure their children started life with an advantage. And from that almost invisible beginning, from that barely perceptible tilt in the distribution of resources and recognition, the entire architecture of human inequality was built. Every palace. Every slave ship. Every stock exchange. Every billionaire with a private rocket. Every gated community, and every food bank existing within sight of each other. It all traces back to a good hunting season 15,000 years ago, and the first person who looked at what they had accumulated and thought, for the very first time in human history, I should hold on to this. If this changed the way you see the world, hit like and subscribe. And drop a comment telling us when you think the moment was that changed everything for human equality.